I would say that everybody can agree with me here that that was a very great start and kick off our conference today by the wonderful Dr. Newman Metcalf. Now we're going to continue with our next keynote speaker, and the keynote speech will focus on the, we're going to discuss about how to provide so Jan Kleijssen, who is going to provide us a speech on the Center of Excellent Actions regarding the AI, as well as interlink between AI and human rights and security. And he's touching up on where we are heading and what should be the next steps taken in order to maintain human values within the AI framework. So Jan works as Director of the Information Society and Actions Against Crime Directorate in the Council of Europe. So welcome on the stage.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone from Strasbourg. Hope the connection is good and that you can all hear me and see me. Thank you very much for this opportunity to give a small talk about what the Council of Europe is doing about artificial intelligence and in particular its impact on human rights. Allow me for a few moments to explain or to recall what the Council of Europe is all about. It is Europe's oldest political organization. It was established in the aftermath of World War II by the likes of Winston Churchill, Konrad Adenauer, de Gasperi, and other great European statesmen and stateswomen to ensure or try to ensure that the horrors of the Second World War would not be repeated in Europe. And the idea was to do so through binding European countries together, even closer, ever closer, by adopting common standards. And these common standards were to be treaties, binding commitments, not mere political declarations, but binding commitments. The best known of these, we now have some 200 of these conventions. The best known is without doubt the European Convention on Human Rights, with its court here in Strasbourg that delivers binding judgments on now 46 member states. Many of you will know that the Council of Europe had 47 member states until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, whereupon the organization very swiftly, within 3 weeks, decided to expel Russia because of its violations of the statute of the Council of Europe, basic human rights, and much else besides. So now 46 European countries which strive together to protect human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And very early on in the history of the Council of Europe, member states realized that in order to protect human rights in modern times, one needed to take account of technology. This is why now 41, nearly 42 years ago, the Council of Europe established the world's first treaty on data protection. And this came at a time when hardly any country in the world had any data protection legislation. And the convention inspired many countries, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere, to adopt this legislation. More than inspired, it actually provided a legal framework, a binding framework for doing so for those states that acceded. There are now some 55 states worldwide that have joined this Data Protection Convention, but many more participate as observers. So the impact of this treaty goes well beyond Europe. Then some nearly 22 years ago, the Council of Europe established the world's first treaty against cybercrime, defining a number of issues relating to crime committed through computer systems, providing for international cooperation, and again, also there providing definitions and inspiring national law. That treaty, the Cybercrime Convention, has become a truly global benchmark with now some 68 parties. We very recently, in the last months, had Nigeria from Africa and Brazil join as parties. The United States has been a party since the beginning, for instance. So it's really a truly global treaty. Another example is child abuse. sadly, the advent of the internet, with all the wonderful advantages it has brought, has also made a number of crimes more profitable. And child pornography is definitely one of those crimes that abuses the internet and modern technologies. And therefore, our Lanzarote Convention to protect children and prevent sexual abuse has been a landmark treaty as well. It defines, for instance, the term grooming via the internet, and the definition of this convention has now found its way into the legislation of many countries, again, worldwide. I'm saying all this to explain why the Council of Europe has taken an interest in artificial intelligence. As was said at the outset, it is clear that I don't have to explain to you all the various applications of artificial intelligence and the impact it has on our daily lives in so many ways. I was at a conference some years ago when I asked whether people were aware that they were interacting with AI, and a number of them in the audience, in fact, the majority of the audience, thought they were not interacting with artificial intelligence. Whereupon, of course, I asked who had a mobile phone. That was the case for everyone, and then, of course, you can guess the rest. That was a few years ago. I think by now everyone is aware that artificial intelligence is employed by the private sector, but also by state authorities to take over many tasks that were previously carried out by humans, when the state, for instance, delegates to systems, but also, of course, entirely new fields have been explored. Profiling has become extremely sophisticated, and there are many applications where indeed artificial intelligence brings great benefits and has the potential to really improve our lives. Thinking about the health sector, about science, about education, culture, and of course also governance, public governance. But it is also clear that artificial intelligence carries risks. I think many of you, most of you, will be aware of the use cases in this respect. Attempts for instance, in the United States to delegate to AI systems decisions that should be taken by parole boards in the criminal justice sector. Attempts for instance, in the UK to have an AI system replace national exams during the pandemic of students at secondary level, high school level, if you like, which turned out to be not successful, to put it mildly, because it turned out that the systems, both the one I mentioned in the United States, the system used in the UK, led to highly biased results, which of course had a lot to do with the fuel that was put in the AI system, if you like, the data that it was fed with, and the bias in the data. For instance, in the US case with regards to parole boards, the system always advised against releasing an Afro-American detainee or suspect because it calculated on the basis of the prison population in the United States. Where, as sadly we know, the African Americans are overrepresented, but that of course had is of no relevance to the individual case whether a particular suspect should be released or not. Secondly, in the UK, it turned out that the bias also took into account neighborhoods, schools, reputation, and came to conclusions which had nothing to do with the performance of the individual children. The most dramatic case so far concerns my own country, the Netherlands, where in an attempt to fight against fraud with regard to child benefits, the tax authorities employed an AI system which led to highly biased results and identified some 26,000 people of migrant origin as having defrauded the system and ordered them to pay back huge sums of money of allowances which the system decided they had unjustly received over the previous years. This caused enormous hardship. There were several suicides. Nearly 2,400 children were taken away from their parents because of this and still haven't been reunited. And it led to the fall of the Dutch government, to a parliamentary inquiry whose report is entitled Unprecedented Injustice. The president of the highest administrative tribunal in the Netherlands publicly apologized on television for miscarriage of justice, because cases were brought by lawyers representing a number of these people who were unjustly accused of having defrauded. But to cut it, or to put it in simple terms, the reaction of the judiciary was generally one of the computer said it was okay. So it was an objective automated system. So how could we possibly challenge its results? Well, it should have been challenged because, as I said, the results were disastrous. That it took, no human lives were lost and a lot of livelihoods were destroyed and are still being destroyed because of this enormous amount of children that now have to be reunited with their parents. So this is, I think, a very telling example of what can go wrong. If you're interested in reading about it, at the request of the Dutch Parliament, the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, which is one of our most prestigious advisory bodies, published a report in October 2021 on this particular scandal. And interestingly enough, in this report, it pointed out that what happened in the Netherlands could also easily happen elsewhere, and urged, therefore, that governance AI was a very important issue for governments to look into. That is exactly what is happening at the Council of Europe, fortunately. In 2019, the member states decided to examine whether it was necessary to have a new law with regard to artificial intelligence, whether new regulations, legal regulations were necessary, or whether existing law, existing frameworks were sufficient. A special committee was set up for that purpose called KAHAI, which managed, despite the pandemic, which of course immediately followed, to produce its so-called feasibility study. Is it feasible? Is it necessary to have a new treaty? Binding framework treaty was not yet the decision, but I'll come to that in a moment. And unanimously, the representatives of that committee found that although several aspects of the use of artificial intelligence are covered by existing law and existing treaties, I mentioned the European Convention on Human Rights, I mentioned the Data Protection Convention, I mentioned the Cybercrime Convention, to give some examples where aspects are covered, but that there were important gaps. On that basis, the Committee of Ministers then put a second question and asked the committee also to identify possible elements for, if there was to be a legal instrument, what should it look like? And at the end of 2021, the committee came to the unanimous conclusion that there should be a treaty, a binding treaty, a decision which was taken up by the Committee of Ministers, which established last year a new committee, and that committee is a real negotiating body with a very strict deadline, November 2023. It should present to the governments of the Council of Europe, to the 46 governments, a draft treaty on artificial intelligence and human rights. What is perhaps interesting to underline in this context is that it's not just the 46 member states of the Council of Europe at the table, but that there are also the 5 observer states of the organization, which include the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, that the governor of Israel uniquely has asked, although it is not a member state of the Council of Europe, but has asked whether it could join these negotiations, and that was granted. And we also recently received expressions of interest from a number of other countries worldwide, some of which are already parties to the other treaties I mentioned, that they would also like to be involved in these negotiations, which of course is very, very encouraging. You may perhaps ask, Council of Europe is doing this, but are you aware that others are also working on questions of artificial intelligence and the protection of people? And of course we are. The European Union is working on its AI Act, an instrument that is based on market regulation and safe products. And we are convinced that our work is highly complementary. The angle of the Council of Europe is, of course, the angle which is decided by, which is the result of our main focus, our main objectives, our mandate, namely to protect human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And therefore, the provisions that we are working on are those specifically relating to those applications of artificial intelligence where these principles, these values can be put at risk. I would like to invite you to look at the website of the Council of Europe, and you'll easily find artificial intelligence, where you will be able to follow the progress of the work on this treaty. In addition to the states, by the way, I mentioned, we also have civil society and a number of representatives of industry at the table. So it is truly a multi-stakeholder process, not just limited to states, but very much also involving citizens, normal citizens through NGOs and business. Because if this treaty is going to be successful, it is of course important that business is fully engaged. Of course, it can be compelled to do so by law, but if it does so voluntarily and helps to shape it in a way that it will actually be as effective as possible, that would be much the better. Questions that the treaty will include are the specific rights, the rights to be informed, the rights to have human oversight, competent human oversight, I should add. I mentioned the case of the Netherlands, where the judges did not feel themselves competent to do so. And therefore, of course, to give a practical example, I hope that the treaty will also lead to appropriate training for judges and prosecutors in order to be able to deal with cases relating to artificial intelligence in an appropriate and competent manner. So very much competent human oversight. The treaty may also put some red lines, for instance, social scoring, the social credits that we know exist in China. And there seems to be a very large consensus that that is something that should not be allowed to be established, and that artificial intelligence systems and applications should never be used, deployed for those purposes. The question was also very interesting, put by the first speaker, whether it's always necessary to use artificial intelligence. And another question that is that the treaty will consider, the future treaty, I should say, will consider, is of course also the impact of the use of AI applications, a human rights impact, a human rights assessment, of course, methodology, the system to do so will be in one way connected to the treaty, either as a part of the treaty or as an annex. Another impact is, of course, the environmental impact. We know that it costs lots of energy to train AI systems, that carbon footprint of AI systems can be huge. And therefore, the question is also, should AI systems be used under all circumstances, or when making this balance, should one also sometimes decide, and I think the answer is obvious from the way I put the question, rather not to use an AI system in a particular context. There's an example in the country I live in here in France, where the Council of Europe is based, where the health ministry decided for environmental reasons at some point not to use a particular AI system because the impact was huge and the gain in accuracy so marginal that it was considered not worth the enormous expenditure and, as I said, the enormous climate impact of the training of the systems that would have been necessary. I'll leave you with some of these thoughts. I look very much forward to the conference. I hope you will be following the Council of Europe's work, and we are confident that by September 23, we will be able to present to the Committee of Ministers a draft treaty which is urgently needed, as the case in the Netherlands and potentially other places have shown, and which will, like the other treaties I mentioned, become a truly global standard, because that is of course also what is needed, not just piecemeal national approaches, not even a regional approach, but a truly global approach to ensure that artificial intelligence, the use of artificial intelligence, respects human rights, rule of law and democracy, and doesn't undermine them. Thank you very much for your attention.